After 1 e4 e5, 2 knight f3 d6, 3 bishop c4, bishop g4, 4 knight c3, which is the better defensive move, 4 h6 or 4 bishop e7? Incorrect. This namby-pamby push, 4 h7 h6, is a loser. It drops at least a pawn to an unpinning combination 5 knight f3 takes e5. Black has essentially two choices. He can take white's queen, or he can take white's knight. Obviously, he should start by analyzing what happens upon taking the queen. 5 bishop g4 takes d1, because the queen is the greater prize. Taking the queen leads to the c4 bishop's capture on f7 with check. 6 bishop c4 takes f7 check. To this intrusion, black has but one response, moving the king to king 2. 6 king e8 e7. White then terminates his opponent by 7 knight c3 d5 checkmate, a pattern commonly referred to as legal's mate. Legal's mate typically occurs by an unpinning combination, 5 knight f3 takes e5, where the winner lets his queen be captured, 5 bishop g4 takes d1, in order to deliver checkmate with the aid of several minor pieces. In our given example, white mates by the teamwork of 3 minor pieces, both knights and the light square bishop. If black sees that taking the queen fails, he could ignore the enemy queen in favor of taking white's venturesome e5 knight. 5 d6 takes e5. But then white's queen captures the g4 bishop. 6 queen d1 takes g4, resulting in white regaining the minor piece and winding up a pawn ahead. Inexperienced players often play moves such as 4 h7 h6, hoping to stop the invasion of an enemy knight. Here, black plays the pawn move to prevent white's f3 knight from going to g5, because he's fearful of a double attack being issued to f7. The double attack would come from the knight at g5 and the bishop at c4. But in the given situation, white's tactical alertness enables him to find another method for attacking f7, to take on e5, exposing his own knight to capture, since e5 is apparently guarded by black's d6 pawn. The tactic, a version of legal sacrifice, succeeds, however, because of the counterattack unveiled by white's queen to the g4 bishop. Correct. The careful move is 4 bishop f8 e7. It stops the legal trick by clearing the square f8 for black's king. Now 5 knight f3 takes e5 falters because after the queen is seized, 5 bishop g4 takes d1, and the pawn is taken with check, 6 bishop c4 takes f7 check. Black's king has an extra escape square at f8. 6 king e8 f8. White doesn't have a mate, nor does he have anything to show for his sacrificed queen. Of course, white doesn't have to throw away his queen. Instead, he can castle. 5 castle kingside. He could also move his queen pawn either 1 or 2 squares up. Any of these offer white a fine position with excellent prospects. Yet black is doing okay too. He's a little cramped, but his position is solid, and nothing drastic is going to happen to him in the foreseeable future. After 1 e4 e5, 2 knight f3 knight c6, 3 bishop b5 a6, 4 bishop takes c6. How should black take white's bishop? 4 d takes c6, or 4 b takes c6. Correct. The better capture is with the queen pawn. 4 d7 takes c6. This violates the principle that encourages taking toward the center when there are two different pawns that can capture on the same square. In capturing this way, 4 d7 takes c6, black's d-pawn actually moves toward the edge of the board. In the beginning of the game, while you shouldn't ignore pawn placement, you shouldn't invest all your effort and energy worrying about it either. Other factors, such as open lines, development, and king safety, can also be important. Placing too much emphasis on one aspect of play may cause you to minimize another equally relevant one. By taking away from the center here, black decides to place greater import on activity and development. He specifically opens avenues for two pieces. He unblocks the c8 h3 diagonal for his queen-bishop, and he clears the d-file for his queen. Depending on how the game goes, these attacking possibilities could outweigh the liability incurred by accepting doubled pawns. It's the latter clearance, taking away from the center with 4 d7 takes c6, that enables black to regain the material most efficiently, after white's f3 knight tries to purloin the e5 pawn. 5 knight f3 takes e5. With the d-file now unobstructed, black simply moves his queen up to d4. 5 queen d8 d4, simultaneously attacking white's knight and pawn. After white salvages the knight, which is the more valuable of the two, 6 knight e5 f3, black recaptures the king pawn. 6 queen d4 takes e4 check. This practically forces a trade of queens. 7 queen d1 e2, queen e4 takes e2 check. 8 king e1 takes e2. For the alternative, 7 king e1 f1 is far more precarious for white's king. It's hard to recommend forfeiting the right to castle just to keep the queens on the board, especially when doing so gives the opponent the better chances. So white should submit to the queen trade, after which black's position is truly satisfactory. Incorrect. Capturing with the b-pawn, 4 b7 takes c6, brings a pawn closer to the center, but it doesn't promote rapid development of the pieces. This is mainly why it's not seen too often in serious competition. Nevertheless, it's playable, and it does allow black to get his pawn back after 5 knight f3 takes e5. He simply delivers a queen fork, 5 queen d8 g5, synchronously attacking the e5 knight and the g2 pawn, neither of which are protected. Naturally, white will save his knight and cede the g2 pawn. After 6 knight e5 f3, queen g5 takes g2, 7 rook h1 g1, queen g2 h3, it's a complicated game, with chances for both sides. After 1 e4 e5, 2 knight f3, knight c6, 3 bishop c4, knight f6, 4 knight g5, which is the better defense? 4 queen e7 or 4 d5? Incorrect. The move 4 queen d8 e7 is the inferior of the two choices, but it does set a slimy trap. If white continues 5 knight g5 takes f7, black can counter with the block 5 d7 d5, gaining time by attacking the bishop that protects the knight. White can take the d-pawn, 6 e4 takes d5, but black's queen steals the knight, 6 queen e7 takes f7, while pinning the d-pawn to the bishop. If white then takes the knight, 7 d5 takes c6, the queen takes the bishop, 7 queen f7 takes c4, leaving black ahead by a minor piece. White, however, doesn't have to play 6 e4 takes d5. Instead, the invasionary knight can take the rook, 6 knight f7 takes h8, whereupon black captures the bishop, 6 d5 takes c4. At this point, white is up the exchange. You are up the exchange if you have a rook and your opponent has a minor piece. But there's a good chance that black will also acquire the knight at h8, for it's cornered and has no apparent escape. Afterward, black will have 2 minor pieces against a rook, which constitutes a clear material advantage. But white could sidestep all this. After 4 queen d8 e7, instead of taking on f7 with his knight, he could invade with his bishop. 5 bishop c4 takes f7 check. This gives check and freezes the action. Black's king is driven to d8, 5 king e8 d8, and white has the time to tidy up house by retreating the bishop to b3, where it's safer than it was at c4. By moving the bishop to safety, white also ensures the bishop's survival in case the g5 knight is chased away by a subsequent h7, h6. Many players mechanically make this mistake. That is, when they have the choice of invading with the knight, for instance knight g5 f7, attacking the rook in the corner, or taking with the bishop, bishop c4 takes f7 check, giving check and making the enemy king move, they perfunctorily barge in with the knight. Blinded by the chance to win the rook, they often undervalue the benefit of forcing the opponent's king to move. Sometimes it's better to take with the knight, sometimes with the bishop, and only move-by-move analysis, not generalized assumptions, can help you decide wisely. Here, 4 queen d8 e7 is refuted by 5 bishop c4 takes f7 check. White winds up winning a pawn. He also forces black's king to move, which deprives it of the castling privilege. Finally, white's produced a more serious invasionary menace, the threat to invade on f7 with the knight, when it really means something, forking the king and rook with check. 7 knight g5, f7 check. These are good enough reasons to avoid playing 4 queen d8 e7. Correct. The superior defense is offered by 4 d7 d5, which blocks out the c4 bishop, so that it's no longer attacking f7. Moreover, the c4 bishop is actually threatened by this advance, so that white is constrained to make decisions. After 4 d7 d5, 2 lines can be dismissed as being good for black. The first entails the bishop's retreat, 5 bishop c4 b3. This loses a pawn to the capture, 5 knight f6 takes e4. Another move that can be discharged is taking the pawn with the bishop, 5 bishop c4 takes d5. Black is riding high after 5 knight f6 takes d5, 6 e4 takes d5, queen d8 takes d5, for the material is even and the threats have been answered. White's best continuation is to capture on d5 with the pawn. 5 e4 takes d5. At this point, black's replies can get quite tricky, and the analysis is best left for another occasion. For now, all you need to know is that by playing 4 d7 d5, black is very much in the game. After 1 e4 e5, 2 knight f3, knight c6, 3 d4, e takes d4, 4 knight takes d4, which is the better way to fight for the center? 4 bishop c5 or 4 d6? Correct. Exert pressure against d4 by developing the king-bishop, 4 bishop f8 c5. In posting the king-bishop on c5, black activates a new piece with a gain of time by threatening to win the d4 knight. White may respond to the threat by exchanging knights on c6, retreating to b3, or defending the d4 knight. No matter, black has respectable resources against these contingencies, thanks to the active stance assumed by bishop f8 c5. Incorrect. The move of the queen pawn d7 d6 is terribly conservative, for it needlessly hems in the f8 bishop. Before moving the queen pawn one square, it's first desirable to mobilize the king bishop to c5 or b4. With d7 d6, black envisions a follow-up plan of actuating the kingside knight, knight g8 f6, and bishop 6 bishop f8 e7. Then black will castle, 7 kingside castle. This establishes a solid defensive formation that's hard to crack. The downside is that black fashions a game with no activity whatsoever. His pieces are placed passively, while white obtains an easy time developing, with greater operating space in the center. Add to this mix the growing initiative white augments because of black's milquetoast approach, and white's overall advantage is assured. After 1 e4 e5, 2 f4 d5, 3 e takes d5, e takes f4, 4 knight f3, should black take or develop? 4 queen takes d5, or 4 knight f6. Incorrect. Don't go pawn grabbing with 4 queen d8 takes d5. Black ends up losing too much time with his queen, and white's initiative goes unchecked. In some instances, white's pieces come pouring out of the box faster than black can deal with them. Let's say that white starts the assault by developing the queen knight, 5 knight b1 c3, which attacks the queen and forces it to flee to safety. If black tries to pursue this ersatz line of attack with 5 queen d5 e6 check, white doesn't bother to block the check at all. Rather, he manufactures a further possibility of aggression by moving the king out of the way. 6 king e1 f2. In chess, it's often possible to turn adversity into advantage. Moving the king to f2 clears e1 for use by the king rook, and if black is not careful, he can get his queen pinned, or worse. An illustration is the continuation 6 bishop f8 c5 check. This too is a pointless check, for it compels white to improve his game by blocking the check, 7 d2 d4. Try not to make moves that force your opponent to better his position. After the necessary retreat, 7 bishop c5 b6, white answers with his own check, 8 bishop f1 b5 check. This check is reasonable, however, for it clears the home rank with a gain of time. Black is coerced into moving his king off the e-file, 8 king e8 d8, to avoid the looming pin of white's king rook. But white plays 9 rook h1 e1 anyway, and if black saves his queen by 9 queen e6 f6, it's mate. 10 rook e1 e8 checkmate. True, this example is exaggerated, but it clearly shows the dangers in the position for the unwary defender. Don't bring out the queen so early unless you know or sense it's the right thing to do. Otherwise, you're probably asking for it. Correct. The development of the king knight, 4 knight g8 f6, is in order. In doing this, black announces that his top priority is to castle, getting his king out of the exposed center. The open e-file is the tip-off. At any moment, white might place a major piece, queen or rook, on the e-file to check the enemy king, pin an enemy unit to the king, or simply tie down black's forces to passivity. As a rule, you can't really begin operations until your king is safely ensconced, where it can't easily be harassed. As far as taking white's d-pawn, this now becomes mainly the province of black's f6 knight, and not so much black's queen, if in the future capturing with a knight f6 takes d5 is feasible. After 1 e4 c5, 2 knight f3 d6, 3 d4 c takes d4, 4 knight takes d4, should black develop a knight or attack one? 4 knight f6 or 4 e5? Correct. The most purposeful move here is 4 knight g8 f6. Black thereby begins the counterplay against white's e-pawn, the only pawn actually on a center square. This plan also explains black's second move, 2 d7 d6. Not only did it release the queen bishop, it also fixed white's king pawn in place by guarding the square in front of it. With e5 controlled by black, white will find it harder to advance the king pawn once black starts to zero in on it. After black develops the king knight, 4 knight g8 f6, then he can decide what he wants to do with his own e-pawn. There are three options. He can leave the king pawn on e7, choosing to develop the king bishop on the flank at g7. He can advance it one square ahead to e6 to maintain influence over the d5 square, or he can move it up 2 squares to contest the critical point d4. Since all three formations require a black knight at f6, it's logically consistent to develop it to f6 at once on move 4. Incorrect. It's not yet a good idea to play the pawn up to king 4, 4 e7 e5. Played too early, it leaves a trail of weakened light squares at d5 and f5, squares that can no longer be guarded by black's e-pawn. To capitalize on black's mistake, white must first nullify the c8 bishop by giving check. 5 bishop f1 b5 check. If black blocks the check with the queen knight, 5 knight b8 d7, then white's knight immediately invades, 6 knight d4 f5. Since the c8 bishop has lost control of f5 because the d7 knight obstructs the diagonal, white's knight is safe from capture. Nor does it help to block the check, 5 bishop f1 b5 check, with the queen bishop, 5 bishop c8 d7. For white trades bishops, 6 bishop b5 takes d7 check, knight b8 takes d7, or 6 queen d8 takes d7, and white's knight comes in 7 d4 f5 anyway. In both cases, whether black blocks at d7 with the knight or the bishop, white keeps a grip on d5 and establishes his knight on f5. Meanwhile, black's only way to get rid of the f5 knight is by the weakening prod g7 g6. Clearly, advancing the king pawn 2 squares ahead, 4 e7 e5 on move 4 is somewhat premature. It allows white to improve his chances without counterbalancing gain. After 1 e4 e6, 2 d4 d5, 3 e5 c5, 4 c3, should black end the central tension or maintain it? 4 c takes d4, or 4 knight c6? Incorrect. It's wiser to hold up the exchange and not play 4 c5 takes d4. After white takes back, 5 c3 takes d4, black has nothing better than developing the queen knight, 5 knight b8 c6, which could be done a move earlier without releasing the tension. You release tension by ending the possibility of future pawn exchanges, either by trading pawns or pushing the capturable pawn past the point of exchange. White is the one who benefits from this unnecessary pawn exchange, because it clears the square c3 for the queen knight. Before the exchange, c3 is blocked by the c pawn, making it impossible for white to place the b1 knight on this optimal square. So by taking 4 c5 takes d4, black actually increases white's options. Correct. It's better for black to retain the tension by developing the queen knight, 4 knight b8 c6. Furthermore, black needn't worry about the possibility of white's queen pawn taking on c5, 5 d4 takes c5, for this would undermine the support for the e5 pawn. It's this e5 pawn that keeps black constricted, in that it impedes the movement of black's own king pawn, which in turn obstructs the movement of black's c8 bishop, the so-called problem bishop. What this means is that black controls the tension at the key exchange points, c5 and d4. It's black who has the option of taking on d4. It's black who can decide when and if to push past c5, c4. And it's black who can mount the pressure against d4 by positioning his queen at b6. This deployment, 5 queen d8 b6, also restricts the development of white's queen bishop, for it places b2 under surveillance. If the c1 bishop moves, black's queen may be able to take on b2 for free. All in all, the balance sheet after 4 knight b8 c6 reads that white has more space because of his advanced e5 pawn, but black has control of the tension because white can't yet afford to take on c5. The chances are about equal. After 1 e4 c6, 2 d4 d5, 3 knight c3, d takes e4, 4 knight takes e4, should black move a pawn or a bishop? 4 e6 or 4 bishop f5? Incorrect. If black plays the passive 4 e7 e6, he's made one too many pawn moves to start the game. It was time to get some pieces out, and 3 moves come to mind. He could develop his queen bishop, 4 bishop c8 f5, his king knight, 4 knight g8 f6, or his queen knight, 4 knight b8 d7. The latter development is part of a 2-move idea where black follows up with the king knight, 5 knight g8 f6, so that the queen knight protects it. This avoids doubled pawns in the event of an exchange on f6. As far as the e-pawn goes, it can be advanced later, preferably after the queen bishop has been activated to f5 or possibly g4. In this manner, black avoids locking the light square bishop inside the pawn chain, averting the creation of a problem bishop. Correct. The better move is 4 bishop c8 f5, which begins to challenge white's central dominance. White has the temporary edge in the middle because of the placement of a pawn on d4 and a knight on e4. Black can't afford to let white have a free hand in the center, and developing the bishop to f5 essentially compels the e4 knight's removal from the region. The best repositioning is to retreat the knight 5 knight e4 g3, because this replacement enables white to gain back a tempo. The attacked e4 knight has metamorphosed into an attacking g3 knight, and black must expend a move extricating the f5 bishop from danger, 5 bishop f5 g6. But black has accomplished his mission. He's coerced white into withdrawing the e4 knight from the center. Now black can focus on the d4 pawn, which he will start operations against by virtue of the subsequent pawn pushes e7, e5, and c6, c5. These advances should keep the game honest. After 1 e4, knight f6, 2 e5, knight d5, 3 c4, knight b6, 4 d4, how should black begin the assault against white's mighty pawn center? 4 knight c6 or 4 d6? Incorrect. Not 4 knight b8 c6, because then matters really get out of hand. White responds with 5 f2 f4, supporting the king pawn. Now when black tries to undermine e5 with 5 d7 d6, it comes too late. White advances 6 d4 d5, driving the c6 knight from the central zone, without repercussions to e5 because it's protected by the f4 pawn. Timing is crucial. The way to shake up the white center is by launching the softening d7 d6 on move 4, not move 5. Developing the queen knight to c6 simply doesn't work without the preparatory 4 d7 d6. Do it when you need to, or you won't need to do it at all. Correct. The right continuation is 4 d7 d6, challenging white's e5 pawn at once. If white tries to provide support at this point, 5 f2 f4, he runs into 5 d6 takes e5, 6 f4 takes e5, knight b8 c6, hitting e5 again. Now the advance 7 d4 d5 is ruled out because it hangs the white king pawn. 7 knight c6 takes e5. So white must spend a tempo to defend the menaced d4 pawn. If he does so by 7 knight g1 f3, black can activate the queen bishop, pinning the f3 knight, 7 bishop c8 g4. This renews the threat to d4, and white must secure this square once more. It's also clear that black has generated the kind of pressure he needs to get a proper share of the play. Note that black must play 5 d6 takes e5 before developing the queen knight. If on move 5 he delays this exchange and instead brings out the queen knight immediately, 5 knight b8 c6, he transposes into the line where white gets to drive the knight away by 6 d4 d5. And, as before, the knight can't take the e5 pawn, in that it's defended by the pawn on f4. After 1 e4 d5, 2 e takes d5, queen takes d5, 3 knight c3, queen a5, 4 d4, which is the better pawn move, 4 c6 or 4 e6? Correct. The semi-waiting move 4 c7 c6 is best. The situation of the black queen on a5 could soon become uncomfortable. By moving the c-pawn, black provides a convenient retreat for the queen once things get too hot. Her Majesty could thereafter transfer to c7 or d8 whenever necessary or pragmatic. The other point about c7 c6 is that it doesn't close off the diagonal of the c8 bishop, as does the move 4 e7 e6. By not yet moving the e-pawn, black is still able to position the queen bishop usefully, either to f5 to influence the b1 h7 diagonal, or to g4 to pin the king knight once it's stationed at f3. Incorrect. Playing 4 e7 e6 is an unfortunate piece of chess timing. It instantly seals the c8 bishop inside the pawn chain, reducing black's queen bishop to the status of an imprisoned piece. What this means is that black will play most of the opening behind by a piece, since the queen bishop won't be able to contribute very much. This also suggests that black's overall attacking capabilities will be greatly diminished. The move 4e7-e6 might also wind up losing a tempo, because in many situations black will want to advance the king-pawn to e5 to attack d4. Since this could be done in one move if black's king-pawn were back on e7, playing the king-pawn to e6 wastes a move that might otherwise be used productively. So on move 4, instead of moving the king-pawn to e6, hold it back in favor of advancing the queen-bishop pawn to c6. As a chess player, you're likely to live a lot longer this way. After 1 d4 d5, 2 c4 d takes c4, 3 knight f3 knight f6, 4 e3, should black block his c-pawn or his c8 bishop, 4 knight c6, or 4 e6. Incorrect. The move with the queen knight, 4 knight b8 c6, is all wrong. The only way that black can put pressure on white's center now is by advancing the king-pawn 2 squares, e7, e5. But black will never be able to implement this move. White already has a 2-to-1 edge on e5, the d4 pawn and the f3 knight versus the c6 knight, and there aren't many ways that black can add to his e5 arsenal. Nor is it going to be easy for black to deploy his queen bishop. For example, after 4 knight b8 c6, 5 bishop f1 takes c4, bishop c8 g4, white wins a pawn by the double attack 6 queen d1 b3, hitting both b7 and f7. Generally, whenever the queen bishop is developed early, it leaves the queen knight 2 square, b7 for black, b2 for white, vulnerable to tactics, such as the above double attack. Perhaps the biggest problem with 4 knight b8 c6 is that it blocks the c-pawn. This means that, to get central play, black is going to have to rely on moving his king-pawn. But the prospects of this advance materializing in the near future are very slim. Correct. The right move is 4 e7 e6. It's relevant to black's first order of business, which is to get pressure against white's center. This black will soon do by advancing the c-pawn to c5, assailing white's d-pawn and making it possible to open the c-file by exchanging pawns. c5 takes d4. The closing of the c8 h3 diagonal, resulting from moving the king-pawn to e6, is not critical in this situation, for black has another way to activate his queen bishop. He can flank it at b7 after first playing the a-pawn to a6 and then moving the b-pawn to b5. Of course, black is yet to achieve all this, but he has good chances of doing so, which renders his game quite playable. After 1 d4 d5, 2 c4 e6, 3 knight c3 knight f6, 4 bishop g5, how should black deal with the pin on his knight? 4 bishop e7 or 4 h6? Correct. Breaking the pin by developing the dark square bishop, 4 bishop f8 e7, is the preferred reply. This frees the king-knight so that it can once again take part in the central festivities, overlooking the middle squares e4 and d5. Meanwhile, the space between black's king and king-rook has cleared, so that castling kingside can now be effectuated at any moment. Finally, the move 4 bishop f8 e7 is weakness-free. No new soft spots have been engendered in the black camp because of it. Incorrect. Attacking the g5 bishop by 4 h7 h6 is a positional mistake. White's bishop will simply capture on f6. 5 bishop g5 takes f6 when black's queen is unable to take back because of its ties to the d pawn. If 5 queen d8 takes f6, then 6 c4 takes d5, e6 takes d5, 7 knight c3 takes d5 simply gains a pawn. So to avoid this material loss, black is compelled to recapture on f6 with the g-pawn. 5 g7 takes f6. Thereafter, white can shatter black's kingside pawn structure completely by exchanging pawns on d5. 6 c4 takes d5, e6 takes d5. The resulting black kingside is punctuated with holes, in that he has doubled isolated pawns on the f-file and a single isolated pawn on the h-file. Breaking it down to its rudiments, the square f5 is ripe for invasion by a white knight, for black doesn't have a pawn on an adjacent file that can guard f5, so black doesn't have a satisfactory way to keep the knight out. Moreover, pawn protection is not possible for the pawns at f6 and h6. Thus, they will require constant protection by black pieces to avoid being overtaken by the marauding white forces. And don't ask where black's king is to find safety, for the g-file, the very file black's king winds up on after castling kingside, is devoid of pawn shelter. This means that once castled, black's king would be terribly exposed to the elements. There are just too many problems here, so prudence recommends avoiding them in the first place by not playing 4 h7 h6. After 1 d4 d5, 2 c4 c6, 3 knight f3, bishop f5, 4 knight c3, should black exercise restraint, or can he win a pawn? 4 e6, or 4 d takes c4. Correct. Since there is no chance to win a pawn, black should show some reserve and move up the king pawn 4 e7 e6. The advance of the king pawn strengthens d5, while opening a path for the dark square bishop. For the meantime, with both the c and e pawns backing up black's d5 pawn, black is playing a so-called strong point defense, with a securely protected queen pawn at the head of a central wedge. There's really only one way that white can try to cause trouble after 4 e7 e6, and this is by developing the queen to b3, menacing the undefended pawn at b7. The b pawn typically loses its natural protection when the queen bishop is developed early. Here 3 bishop c8 f5. In the event of 5 queen d1 b3, black can save the day by activating his own queen, placing it on b6, and offering a queen trade in the process. After 5 queen d8 b6, 6 queen b3 takes b6, a7 takes b6, black's queenside pawn structure is slightly impaired, but he gets an open a file for his queen rook, which more than offsets the weakened pawns. Incorrect. Taking the queen bishop pawn by 4 d5 takes c4 runs into a buzzsaw. By loosening his grip on e4, black allows an immediate strike with 5 e2 e4, kicking black's queen bishop in the face. Black will have to waste a move saving this bishop, while white's own light square bishop obtains an open diagonal, f1 a6, without loss of time. If black tries to fight for his stolen booty, the c4 pawn, retreating his bishop to e6 to defend it, 5 bishop f5 e6. White pushes the queen pawn to d5, 6 d4 d5, and soon regains the pawn on c4. 6 c6 takes d5, 7 e4 takes d5, bishop e6 g4, 8 bishop f1 takes c4. The end result is that black has surrendered the center, lost space and time, and has nothing to show for his efforts. Advantage, white. After 1 d4 knight f6, 2 c4 e6, 3 knight f3 bishop e7, 4 g3, should black start a fianchetto or check with his king bishop? 4 b6 or 4 bishop b4 check? Correct. Work on developing a new piece with 4 b7 b6. It's clear that the c8 bishop can hardly be mobilized along the c8 h3 diagonal, for both d7 and e6 are presently blocked by pawns. The logical thing to do, therefore, is to find another diagonal for the bishop. With 4 b7 b6, black prepares to fianchetto the c8 bishop at b7, when the light square bishops for both sides will then occupy the same diagonal, a8 h1, and can contest the same critical middle squares, d5 and e4. The play then moves along the standard lines of the Queen's Indian defense, in which black attempts to dominate the middle mainly with piece play, rather than pawn advances. Incorrect. Moving the dark square bishop again, 4 bishop e7 b4 check, for the second turn in a row, is a loss of time. If black had wanted to develop his bishop to b4, he could have done so on move 3, saving a tempo. Now white has essentially the same position, but with the useful move 4 g2 g3 thrown in for free. It generally requires an unusual set of circumstances to justify moving the same piece twice in the opening. A successful example of this violation to principle occurs after 4 b7 b6, 5 d4 d5. Here black exchanges pawns, 5 e6 takes d5, 6 c4 takes d5, and then attacks the d pawn by completing the fianchetto, 6 bishop c8 b7. If white now guards his d pawn by 7 knight b1 c3, black should move his dark square bishop for a second time, 7 bishop e7 b4, pinning the c3 knight and forcing the subsequent gain of white's d pawn. Note that white can't uphold the d pawn by 8 e2 e4, because with the c3 knight pinned, black's f6 knight can take the e4 pawn for free. Black can also win the e pawn by first taking on c3, 8 bishop b4 takes c3 check, and after 9 b2 takes c3, simply removing the unguarded king pawn. 9 knight f6 takes e4. After 1 d4 knight f6, 2 knight d2, e5, 3 d takes e5, knight g4, 4 h3, where should black move his attacked knight? 4 knight takes e5, or 4 knight e3. Incorrect. The capture of the e5 pawn does not go far enough. It's what might be called a sin of omission, since it fails to exploit white's last error, 4 h2 h3. Other than this, 4 knight g4 takes e5 is not a bad move. It reestablishes material equality and leaves black with a splendid game. But a splendid game is not a winning one, so capturing the pawn on e5 must be considered a mistake itself. Correct. White has to go all the way and play 4 knight g4 e3, attacking and threatening to win White's queen. If the f-pawn doesn't take the knight, White's queen is lost. 5 knight e3 takes d1. If the f-pawn does take White's invasive knight, 5 f2 takes e3. Black scores with the decisive check 5 queen d8 h4 check. White can delay the inevitable for one move, 6 g2 g3, but Black takes the g-pawn. 6 queen h4 takes g3 checkmate, and this is mate. White's problems ensue from his fourth move, 4 h2 h3, a move he doesn't have to play. This advance weakens the square g3, which is suddenly deprived of the h-pawn's protection. By moving the knight to e3, Black tries to lure away the g3 square's other pawn protector, the f2 pawn. White finds himself on the horns of a dilemma. Either he gets mated, or he loses his queen, all because of a needlessly weakening pawn move. How should White avoid all this? He can use his fourth move more productively, improving his position with 4 knight g1 f3, developing a new piece toward the center and guarding h4. This stops the potential intrusion of Black's queen, which means that White is not about to get mated. After 1 c4 knight f6, 2 knight c3 e6, 3 knight f3 d5, 4 c takes d5, how should Black recapture? 4 knight takes d5, or 4 e takes d5. Incorrect. Not with the knight, 4 knight f6 takes d5. This way of recapturing transgresses the principle that advocates taking with the least valuable unit, here the pawn. Typically, when you break a rule without a good reason, there's a price to be paid. The penalty in the given situation is that White gets to usurp the center by 5 e2 e4. Black can save his knight without losing time by trading on c3. 5 knight d5 takes c3, 6 b2 takes c3. But even after the thrust 6 c7 c5, White is still able to create an ideal pawn center with 7 d2 d4. His two central pawns, aligned and ready for action, ensure that White has a definite advantage, which he can maintain into the middle game. Correct. The right recapture is with the pawn, 4 e6 takes d5. This guarantees that Black keeps a pawn in the center, and it's this pawn that gives Black the opportunity to contest the e4 square. Moreover, by taking with the e-pawn, Black clears the c8 h3 diagonal for the queen-bishop. If White now advances his queen-pawn 2 squares ahead, 5 d2 d4, he halts the possible march of Black's d-pawn and transposes into a queen's gambit. 1 d2 d4, d7 d5, 2 c2 c4. This is fine for Black, who can further augment the pressure on e4 by developing the queen-bishop to f5, and after castling, by moving the king-rook to e8. After 1 c4 knight f6, 2 knight c3 e5, 3 g3 c6, 4 knight f3, should Black push his king-pawn or defend it? 4 e4, or 4 d6. Correct. It's largely a matter of style and temperament, but we prefer 4 e5 e4, saving the pawn and attacking the f3 knight. Aggression should count for something. By advancing the e-pawn to e4, black picks up the game's tempo and gathers space in the middle. The white knight is likely to relocate to d4, where it can be attacked again by either the queen from b6 or the king-bishop from c5. Crucial for black is that his e4 pawn can be supported by his queen pawn. This is made possible by his third move, 3 c7 c6, which bolsters the subsequent advance d7 d5. If after the pawn comes to d5, white should take the d-pawn, c4 takes d5, black's c-pawn is in position to take back, c6 takes d5, keeping the pawn chain intact. Incorrect. Steady defense for the e-pawn can be provided by 4 d7 d6. In its own way, it's probably just as good as the alternative 4 e5 e4, but it's more defensive in character and outlook. After this one-square advance of the queen pawn, black plans to develop the king-bishop to e7 and then castle. As long as white undertakes no offensive action in the center, black will encounter few problems. But if white should become active with d2 d4, black will have to reconsider his strategy. He may have to play the move e5 e4 after all. After 1 c4 c5, 2 knight c3 knight f6, 3 knight f3 knight c6, 4 d4, should black exchange or defend? 4 c5 takes d4, or 4 e6. Correct. The capture 4 c5 takes d4 is right on the money. Black not only saves his pawn, but he prevents the white d-pawn from advancing menacingly up the board, where it would attack and dislodge black's c6 knight. Black must understand why he played the move 1 c7 c5 in the first place. Its purpose was to exercise pawn control over the d4 square. This implies that when white puts something on d4, the c5 pawn is supposed to take it. Since exchanging on d4 enables black to garner a central pawn majority of 2-1, d-pawn and e-pawn versus e-pawn, and since such a majority is usually advantageous, it's quite illogical to defend the c-pawn by 4 e7 e6 instead of exchanging it for white's d-pawn. Incorrect. The weaker move is 4 e7 e6. Its immediate intention is to answer the capture 5 d4 takes c5 with the recapture 5 bishop f8 takes c5, retaining material equality. Black also hopes to advance the queen pawn to d5 sometime later. But neither of these ideas comes to fruition, for white crosses them up by crossing midfield, 5 d4 d5. This advance menaces the c6 knight. It also blocks the d5 square so that black is unable to advance his queen pawn 2 squares ahead. If black tries to get rid of this pernicious d-pawn, 5 e6 takes d5, white's c-pawn is in position to take back, 6 c4 takes d5. At the end of this transaction, black still has to remove his c6 knight to some useless square, forfeiting both time and position. How could black have avoided all this? By taking white's d-pawn on move 4. 4 c5 takes d4. After 1 knight f3 d5, 2 c4 d takes c4, 3 e3 knight f6, 4 bishop takes c4. Should black pin the f3 knight or develop the f8 bishop? 4 bishop g4 or 4 e6. Incorrect. Do not play 4 bishop c8 g4 here. It's a mistake which loses material. White can demonstrate its erroneousness in 2 different ways. First, there's moving the queen to b3. 5 queen d1 b3, which issues a double attack to b7 and f7. Black can save one or the other, but not both. Second, there's a combination starting with a temporary bishop sacrifice on f7. 5 bishop c4 takes f7 check, which sets up a knight fork at e5. If black takes the offered bishop, 5 king e8 takes f7. White unpins with 6 knight f3 e5 check. Black must move his king out of check, 6 king f7 e8, whereupon white's e5 knight takes the g4 bishop, 7 knight e5 takes g4. Even if black takes back, 7 knight f6 takes g4, white's queen is there to finish off the combination, 8 queen d1 takes g4, regaining the piece and leaving white a pawn ahead. So white emerges from the combination with both a material plus as well as a positional one, especially because black's king has lost the castling privilege. Correct. The alert move is 4 e7 e6. True, this advance closes the c8 h3 diagonal, locking his own queen-bishop inside the pawn chain. But more importantly, it obstructs the attacking diagonal of white's c4 bishop, stopping once and for all any shots to the f7 square. The move e7 e6 also has its offensive side, for with the a3 f8 diagonal unblocked, the dark square bishop is empowered to support the advance c7 c5. This counterattack would pressure d4. As for some of the other black pieces, the king-bishop will probably go to e7. Black will then castle kingside. Eventually he will flank his queen-bishop on b7. At this point, black will have a better idea what to do with the rest of his life. After 1 knight f3, knight f6, 2 g3, g6, 3 bishop g2, bishop g7, 4 kingside castle, should black maintain the symmetry or create imbalance? 4 kingside castle or 4 b5? Correct. Black is free to castle, and he should do it right here on move 4, 4 kingside castle. There's no inherent value in keeping the black king at e8, and since white knows that castling is high on his opponent's agenda, why shouldn't black play it at once? Castling offers a number of benefits, while revealing very little information. What white doesn't know much about, however, is how black intends to arrange his center pawns. 3 options come to mind. Black could advance the c-pawn to c5. He could advance the d-pawn to d5. Or he could move the d-pawn just to d6, with the idea of backing up the king-pawn subsequent advance to e5. All of these aims are quite reasonable, and to be expected. But, as already indicated, black's real secret is what he intends to do with his center pawns. By castling on move 4, he keeps white guessing and maintains the greatest freedom of choice. Incorrect. Black's leeway does not extend to 4 b7 b5, which is a bad move. The plan is to oppose white's flanked bishop at b7. But white's bishop is already in place, and he is the first to strike. White unmasks the g2 bishop by 5 knight f3 d4. This attacks the a8 rook, while the d4 knight additionally threatens the b5 pawn. Black could try to save both by 5, c7, c6, but this fails to prevent 6, knight d4 takes b5. White is able to take this apparently protected b-pawn because the defender, the c6 pawn, is pinned to the a8 rook by the g2 bishop. So the net result of the advance of the b-pawn to b5 is that it drops a pawn.